There was an amazing confession that was obtained by a detective who's quite celebrated. His name is Jim Smith, who got a confession from a colonel in the Canadian forces named Russell Williams. And it's all over the internet. People have been watching this, like a 10-hour video where he goes from just like being all cool and stuff like that to ultimately at the end not only confessing to his crimes and telling them what other things he'd done, but leading them to the body and everything else. And the interview is actually very fascinating to watch, and it was masterfully handled.
Yeah, the officer did a fantastic job.
By Officer Smith, Detective Smith.
With also an accused who probably ultimately wanted to confess.
But I came across a really interesting other case with the exact same detective where the confession, which was kind of a semi-confession, was actually not admissible in court. And this case, I find really amusing because there's some cultural references that the judge, goes to in terms of why it was that he felt some boundaries were crossed. So first of all, it says Staff Sergeant Smith informs him that he has specialized knowledge. I'm an expert on this, right? And he gives him two options. You're either a cold-blooded killer or you're just a nice guy who snapped and had a bad moment, right?
And that's a classic Reed technique of interrogations as well for anyone who's watched some of the older episodes where that's been mentioned.
He says, the crime has been solved. We already have all of this evidence, and we know that you're the one who did it. And so the judge says, the essential message is, resistance is futile. And so this is my favorite paragraph.
For Star Trek fans.
Yeah. So I'm going to have to take my glasses off to read this. Yeah, this is an actual decision that's published online. The notion of futile resistance is apt. One can hardly hear those words without being put in mind of the Borg portrayed in Star Trek, The Next Generation. Case. This is an actual judge's decision. That civilization was known to overwhelm and assimilate entire other civilizations. In stating its intent, the Borg collective always announced, resistance is futile. When I compare Staff Sergeant Smith's interview with the November 19th interview conducted by another detective, I observe a great difference in his body language. And so then he describes, originally he's cooperating, he's sitting forward, he's engaged in the process. And then when he's being interviewed by Sergeant Smith, his demeanor and tone are completely different, where he's moving away. Smith gets in his personal space,
right,
and he's moving backwards as much as possible. So we have this, but then he keeps going back to this whole resistance is futile, and he goes through a number of different things that happened in the course of the interview, which he says essentially gave the message, resistance is futile. And I can't tell you what joy it gives me to see Star Trek Next Generation and the Borg mentioned
But
in a
what
court
was
decision.
the result of that case?
So ultimately they decided that the interview was not admissible, that his statements were not admissible in court because it was a relentless, low-key though, very low-key. But he also engaged in a number of behaviors, one of which asserted that they had evidence that they did not have.
And eventually it overcame the will of the accused.